been added to the list because this is done voluntarily. And so the fact that it's voluntary, first of all, there hasn't been any transparency as to the exact types of content that are being blocked, and there's no real remedy to challenge if a site has been blocked. So if I have a sex education site and I discover that my site is being blocked, there's no way of complaining about it. And I think that's an interesting trend that we're also seeing in relation to free expression, because the more filtering and notice and takedown there is, it's very difficult because it's against a private actor. When you're being, well, I'll say censored, but when your information is being blocked or content removed, it's really hard to challenge it. There's a real problem in terms of remedies, due process, and transparency. The only caveat in the case that we had with the United Kingdom is that in principle people are able to ask their internet service provider not to put the filters on. But the problem is that because people usually don't really know how to use software, or it takes, I don't know if you've ever tried to get in touch with your mobile providers to try and get something fixed. We all know that it always takes forever, it's really complicated, and sometimes you just give up because it's just too much hassle. So here the filters are being put on like by default, and people have to actively ask for no porn please, or no, we don't even know what. So that's one of the concerns that I wanted to talk about. The second thing I wanted to talk about is in relation to notice and takedown. Are you all familiar with notice and takedown? Do you know what this means? Maybe a show of hands. All right. So what happens is that you all know that now people can just, put in comments and, share their content on various platforms, such as YouTube and many others. Now, people can also, so they generate their own content. And here you have like different interests that go into play. So for instance, very often with user-generated content, it may be, say, for instance, that it will be copyright protected. So the copyright owner will want to complain about the material and will want the material to be either filtered or taken down. Most of the time, it won't be very effective for them to go to the user, so it's more interesting for them to go to the intermediary. The intermediary in a lot of countries is protected, has an immunity from liability, so they're not responsible for the content because they're only providing the platform. However, in a lot of countries, when they're notified that there's content that is illegal, they have an incentive to remove it, because if they don't remove it, that means that they may be held liable for it as if it were their own content. So this creates problems because very often what we've seen, so what is called the notice and takedown regime, is that anybody can complain about anything they don't like, essentially. They give very little information about the nature of the complaint, and then because the intermediary risks being held liable, they just remove it without examining it. And when you think about the vast amount of content that is, available online, what happens is that an awful lot of material disappears, and without any real process or without anybody really noticing. So that has a chilling effect on freedom of expression. Now, I'm just going to give you just a little example of a case we were involved in the European Court of Human Rights, called the Delphi case. In that case, there was an article published on the Delphi website, which is a news site in Estonia. It's very popular. It was an article about an issue of public interest. It was about ice roads in Estonia. Don't ask me what this means, I'm not sure. But it was certainly of interest to the people in Estonia. There was a comment about the various companies that were involved in putting those ice roads. And so when people reacted to the comments, some of them used abusive language to describe the company or some of the people who were involved in these ice roads. And so there was a complaint to remove the comments. And Delphi removed the comments almost immediately. Nonetheless, so you would have thought that, having removed the content without even looking at whether or not the content was in fact unlawful and defamatory, or whatever the law was in Estonia, so the content was just removed. And but still, the person sued Delphi and in damages, despite the fact that it actually done, what you could have expected in the circumstances. And so we got involved in the case because we generally don't like notice and takedown, because we think that intermediaries are not best placed to make these determinations. In fact, they don't. So they just remove the content, and this has a chilling effect on freedom of expression. But here, they actually almost played by the book, but nonetheless, they still got sued for it. So at first instance, the European Court of Human Rights agreed with the government and said, yes, it was right that it was removed. And in fact, Delphi should have done even more than what they did, because they took a bit too long. They should have put more filters in place. They should have foreseen that what was in the main article would have spurred these types of comments. I don't know if you can imagine, like every time you put something out, you're trying to figure out how people are going to react to what you're saying. They even recognized that the article was in the public interest. Fortunately, when we all got together in very dynamic coalition with nearly 70 newspapers associations, internet service providers associations, and so on, sort of explained to the court, look, I think here you got it wrong, there's a problem. This is also stifling for innovation, because, newspapers are going to die, because I don't know if some of you are involved in the newspaper industry, but personally as a user, I live in the United Kingdom, I read newspapers, and usually I tend to go for, what is the article that got all these comments? There must be something interesting. Some of these comments are actually pretty hilarious as well. So it creates a really vibrant platform for public debate. So fortunately, we managed to convince the court to reconsider the case, and we're now waiting to hear the outcome, which may be about a year. So I'm going to stop here now, because I've already done quite a bit of talking. And what I'd like is to hear from you what your concerns are in your countries, how do you think a coalition might be good for. So please raise your hands and I'll give you the mic. Anybody? Please.
Hi, my name is Renato. I'm from Brazil, from the Center of Technology and Society. And I do know the work from the Article 19. I do follow not only in Brazil, but the rest. And I do think that, I guess everybody heard about Brazil here during the IGF and Net Mundial and everything. But I don't see anybody speaking how is the index of censorship in Brazil when it comes to online content. And Article 19 has written about it. For years and years, Brazil, although it's a democracy and has so innovative and the new internet and civil regulation of the internet, it has been on the for years, it was the first one, a number of requests to Google to remove content, and the last year was the second one. And as right now we are on an electoral period over there, and more content has been taken down. Several people just arrested because they just put some content online that was just criticizing politicians. And I guess one of the things that I didn't see here in the IGF, and maybe Article 19 could do something, or I don't think we have time anymore, but anyway, it's right there already. But it's to show the other side of Brazil, and not only the good influence of Net Mundial and the good influence of a law that tries to put the liability of the intermediary, gives almost total immunity to the intermediary, but still the judiciary branch has given a lot of room for censorship on the internet and content over there. Yes.
Thank you. Also, one thing to bear in mind is that even though you may have a framework for intermediary liability, there's always terms and conditions, and content can be removed under those terms and conditions. And one of the problems that's been discussed, I think, in other sessions is that although the transparency report are already a great initiative from the companies in terms of transparency, but unfortunately, it doesn't really give a full picture, because it includes the requests from governments and court orders, but it doesn't really say much about the content that's removed under their own terms and conditions. My understanding is that, you know, it can be tricky because a lot of complaints can come and be very a bit like spam. So it's a high volume, but nonetheless, it still doesn't give a very accurate picture of how much content is actually removed. Anybody else want to share their concerns and their countries? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is Nuran from Turkey. First of all, I would like to thank you not to leave the battlefield and to share your ideas with us. And during the last 3 days, from the sessions, I got the idea that blocking and filtering mechanisms for the protection of minors, children, and for the reason of copyright, one of the measures, but it's a dilemma. There is a dilemma because the governments would like to protect, and for the public interest, they put blocking and filtering mechanisms. But on the other side, together with the youths and the public, do not want, and they are not very enthusiastic to accept or to share the same feelings with the governments. But how can we deal? I mean, you mentioned about the child pornography and to pornography, where child pornography is forbidden everywhere in the world, but not pornography. Adult pornography is allowed in some countries, but not also in some countries. And it is very tiny detail maybe, but how can we come together in the world? I mean, I just entered yesterday a session on the Charter for the protection of minors rights. And today, this morning, there are nice guidelines prepared by the UNICEF and ITU just for the child protection. There are many guidelines, many regulations, soft laws, but how can we going to apply together? I mean, with developing countries and developed countries. Thank you.
I'll take another question and then I'll get back to you.
Hello, I'm Selin. I'm from Turkey. I'm a lawyer, and I just want to give an example of this removal requests and taking down requests. So maybe you just followed the news and they blocked and censored Twitter. It was not about the child protection, and it was about they just some group of people, they revealed the politicians' records and recordings and the voice records. And so instead of, I don't know which was harmful content for whom, but they just censored Twitter and YouTube. So I think, okay, maybe the child safety is reasoning for takedown requests, but at some point, I think this point of view is just misused, and lots of politicians are misusing it, and the extent is getting broader and broader. So where we are going to put the limitation? Thank you.
Hi, I'm John from Save the Children Denmark. We have a huge dilemma that we have been trying to solve for the last year and a half, I think, is that we have a hotline against child sexual abuse images, also called child pornography. And we each day make reports and try to find the pictures and have the notice and take down, actually. But a year and a half ago, there was a huge trend by young people who took naked selfies of themselves and put them online, for instance, on Instagram. And they were actually above the age limit, so it actually was child pornography. What to do with that? We don't know actually what to do, so actually, if anybody have an idea, I would like to really listen.
Okay. So maybe I'll just share a few thoughts on this, and then we'll move on to the other speakers. I mean, I think the problem that we see time and again with website blocking, I mean, one has already been mentioned, is the slippery slope, which, you start by blocking one type of content, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're blocking something else, which, wasn't, which in a way doesn't even have like a legal basis for it, because it was not provided for. The other problem we see with website blocking is that the filters, although they must be improving as technology develops, but they either underblock or overblock. So what you end up with is, in a way, a sense of false security, because you look like you're doing something about a problem, but without actually solving it. It looks like, yes, those filters were taking care of the problem, but in fact, either the content is, as I was mentioning, underblocked, or other content, legitimate content, gets blocked in the middle. So that's obviously an issue. In terms of international standards on human rights, the UN Special Rapporteur has been very clear, and there's been a case, the Yildirim case in the European Court, which says very clearly that you need to have a legal basis and you need to have safeguards when you have a blocking order. It should be done by a court, but also it should be strictly tailored to be proportionate. And so far as European jurisprudence is concerned, any blanket ban usually is going to be found to be disproportionate. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, when you're talking about especially child pornography, at the end of the day, what you need is prosecute these people rather than just, block content. Like what you really need is, prosecution if you have the evidence that you need against those people. So that's the real measure that should be taking place. Of course, it's often harder. So that's also an issue. Our position based on international standards is that, to the extent that you want to have filters, just let the user choose. And, let parents take responsibility for their children. Because otherwise it's like the state saying, well, we're going to put like a little policeman everywhere you go online to try and check on whether or not it is safe. And it's not really, turning people, making them responsible for what they do. And in the case of children, we think that it should be their parents. If you can have something, you put it on your device, it's your choice, but at least it's not affecting what others can get access to. And in the UK, that was the sort of reaction, which was that well, so all of a sudden we all need to look at what a 5-year-old can have a look at. To go back to the other point that was made about child pornography, we've heard more recently a debate around revenge porn or sexting and all these types of things. And again, there's a lot of outrage usually, and certainly we agree that what you're talking about very often is a breach of privacy for something that has little free speech value. At the same time, the problem is the means used to address the problem. Usually we'd say, well, look at what's already available on the statute book and see whether the circumstances fall within that. So for example, harassment, does it amount to harassment or threat or violence? Now, I think in the case of child pornography, it's a tricky one, because I think it's, for example, in the UK, which is the system I know best, this is something that would fall to the prosecution, that it would have to exercise discretion. And here it leaves it still doesn't give a very strong guarantee, because they have to exercise this discretion wisely. And again, we've seen in other cases how they've used very broadly drafted laws to prosecute individuals for what they said online, when in fact it was innocuous and things that would not normally have been prosecuted if it had been said in the offline world, down the pub or in a cafe. So this is where I think it's really important to have various tools to try and educate users about what, and children in particular, about what they might find online, how also to protect themselves. It is true that the real name policy of organizations such as Facebook is said to be good to give a measure of control of civility on the platform, because people don't lash out completely when it's in their real name. At the same time, it also creates problems in their own right. So, for example, if you're talking about children, if you have like prying adults trying to lure children online. But I'll stop here and I'll take some more questions.
Thank you. I would like to share some of the latest trend and some of my questions. I'm Serenade Wu from Hong Kong, and I'm a journalist, also working for the International Federation of Journalists. First, one thing I would like to share is about when you just mentioned about EU court, they have different kinds of standards. One thing which is if one company that they wanted to order to close a website or something, that kind of things, they need an order. But I would like to say it only happens in Europe countries. When you are talking about in other countries, there's no way for them to follow this, and they just wanted to think that administrative law or administration's power is more important than the others. So this is one thing we are always facing at. Sometimes, I have to say, we feel powerless. And the other things I would like to share is about the trend. Lately, in particular, because we are focusing on monitoring press freedom violations in those of the authoritative regime, they started to cooperate with the business sectors under the good name of best practice or agreement which signed by different sectors. So it makes you feel a little bit more uneasy to compete with. And the other thing is government started not only to block those of the so-called involved of sensitive issues websites, they also engage those of the social networking platforms. They use these as their mouthpiece to disseminate all the informations. But at the same time, they will shut the other dissenting voices. So this is one of the trends. It also happened in Hong Kong. quite a number of the government officials, they like to make use of this internet system to convey their messages. Instead, they come out to face to the press, to answer all the questions. So this is another difficulties that we are facing at. So I'm really looking for whether there's any solutions to deal with it. Thanks.
Anyone else? We'll get back to your point. Here and here. Thanks.
Yeah. I actually wanted to share a little about the India experience with freedom of expression and then make some broad points. My name is Bishakha Datta and I work with a non-profit in India called Point of View. So we are facing a really complicated situation right now where there's a case in the Supreme Court as well as a petition in Parliament asking for a ban on online pornography. Yeah, which again, the complexity is that we feel that not only is it completely technically unfeasible, that also it, will obviously achieve nothing, will be like a serious onslaught on freedom of expression. And the arguments that are being used in the court cases, we've had a series of sort of very high-profile sexual violence cases recently in India, and the arguments are that if you ban online porn, violence against women will go down, which there's no evidence anywhere in the world, right? But I think one of the real problems we face is that policymakers don't understand sort of the technical aspects, as well as that, this is not, like they don't understand sort of the space in many ways. And it's become increasingly difficult to actually make arguments. And the other problem is that even when we pitch it as freedom of expression, we are likely to be put into a sort of like evil, like a morality frame. And it's very hard currently with a right-wing conservative government in India. So we're actually trying to strategize on what to do. The other thing I wanted to say, and I would like to ask what people think about it, is I feel like it's not just governments that are threats to freedom of expression online. I think we face a lot of private censorship from platforms. And there have been many cases recently from Facebook, Instagram, etc., where even people who are not actually violating their terms of service, if you were to carefully examine it, are getting thrown off, right? So this is sort of an arbitrary way in which regular people in countries where we don't have huge website blocking by the government are still facing like day-to-day censorship.
Thank you. Just one more.
Just briefly, I'm Daphne Plu from Argentina, and I work for the APC Women's Rights Program. And we are working now on a project on violence against women and ICT and use of ICTs. And we find that when there is harassment and diminishing of women online, it is also affecting their freedom of expression because they decide to leave the sites. For instance, they decide to close their Facebook accounts or their Twitter accounts or stop blogging because they feel harassed. So I think that there's a big problem there that at this moment we're having that hate speech against women, misogynist speech is also limiting their possibilities to express themselves and to participate online.
Thank you. Just to reflect very briefly on what you were mentioning about pornography, I mean, it is well known that it's extremely hard to define it. I mean, if you look at works of art dating from the antiquity, you have a lot of statues, rather, of naked men and women that could well qualify as pornography. And I think what this illustrates is that, I mean, I think even if you thought about like how, even if you prohibited your teenage boy from looking at pornography, he may well find a way of finding it. So really, I think the problem with these filters is that it allows the government to look like they're doing something once again, but the filters themselves are not effective. And one of the things that we see time and again is actually if, and we're talking here about criminals looking at, say, like real child pornography, they're not really Googling it. They're much more likely to be in other networks where it's harder to catch them. So ultimately, it's more the general public, which is less tech savvy, that doesn't get access to content which is legitimate and lawful. Just to go back briefly to the point that was made earlier about how governments also use social media for their own purposes. I think it's a very tricky one in terms of how it's used to, well, depending on how you view it, is either to manipulate or direct the debate. We had this problem in Tunisia, for instance, and knowing how and when can government officials use social media during the time of elections. And I think for some of these more discrete issues, I think it would probably be better to start by regulating the parties themselves in terms of what they do and their own use. We see regularly how the use of social media and other things in the workplace is more constrained. So I think it's not impossible to think about, like, especially when you're talking about election time, how this could be within certain limits, and that would have to be checked against the usual principles, so far as we're concerned, of does it have a legal basis, is it necessary and proportionate, and think about these kinds of solutions. Now, just to think briefly about women, I think it's a tough one because it has to, and with the whole debate about cyberbullying, we don't really have a definition. It does have a chilling effect on their freedom of expression. At the same time, it's really difficult to say, well, you know, some people have a very robust and frankly despicable way of expressing themselves. However, as a free speech advocate, when you look on balance, before you apply a restriction on their own speech, it has to comply with a number of requirements. And if it doesn't reach that sort of level of threat of violence, for instance, or if it's not enough to amount to harassment, then depending on the measures that are taken against those trolls, it may well be disproportionate. It's not because someone is using very abusive behavior that they should go to prison, for instance. So again, I think here it's a lot of dialogue and probably education on how to respond to that kind of behavior, to be better armed to deal with those issues. I think we had someone else who wanted to speak at the back.
I'm a journalist from Radio Netherlands, and I have something more positive to share with everybody here, because everyone, I heard people were talking about censorship from the state and from different spectrums, and I have seen some really exciting development in China. Some civil society groups, they have been developing this technology called collateral freedom, which basically use clouds to make websites that have conventionally been blocked in China unblockable. So people in China, they don't need to use VPN or proxy servers to be able to access to these websites. And what's funny thing is, even Google has been blocked in China, and they made a mirror for Google called Free Google, so people in China could still use Google service.
Great, thanks very much. We need good news. Anyone else wants to talk about or share their experience and try and think about solutions? One of the things I've been wondering personally is, especially thinking about the right to be forgotten, which may not be of direct concern to all of you here, but what we're seeing is that when individuals want their personal data to be erased, now Google has an obligation to consider their request. And it's under data protection law. If Google refuses to comply with a request and refuses to erase the data from its index, then the person can complain to the Data Protection Commissioner. Now, if, on the other hand, your content is de-indexed, you have no such remedy. So, first of all, you have to count on Google to tell you, to notify you that your content, that someone has asked that the link to your content should be removed, which in itself can be a problem because, for instance, even if you're a business, say for instance, it's arguably a tortious interference with, what you're trying to convey to the public, and so you have to count on Google first of all, but then you can't complain really to anyone. You have to hope that Google will do the right thing, and then if your content still gets removed, you don't really have a means of complaining. So one of the things I've been wondering about is if we should perhaps think about new causes of action, possibly. I'm speaking in legal terms here, but so that you have a remedy when you have that kind of interference with your freedom of expression. So I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on this, would like to share their views on how we could try and solve some of these problems.
No, that's my name is Joellen Kaiser, and I'm with the Media Consortium in the United States. And I think one of the reasons that I'm sort of stuck here is that a lot of the problems that are being caused are happening in a legal framework. And, we're all, I represent journalists who are working in a journalistic framework. And so we don't really, it's hard for us to grapple with the legal issues, and also even to find some representation and to understand exactly also the fact that they're global issues, like the right to be removed is global, and so it's hard to even know exactly where one will intervene. Like, I'm not sure how, a lot of US journalists are very upset about the right to be forgotten, but it's not clear to us how we would intervene in that debate.
Well, I certainly understand that, it is a challenge in terms of how global it is. At the same time, thinking about the right to be forgotten, it's interesting that, that first of all, a link would have to be established with the EU. So I imagine if, for instance, you had content which is, and the link is erased, but it still has readership in the EU, it's not impossible to imagine that there would be enough of a connection to. But again, you still have an issue about complaining that your content has been removed. That's a general, that's a general problem. What we see very often in terms of which law is applicable, you have some relatively straightforward scenarios where everything is just in one country, so it's not too much of a problem. Usually, one of the difficulties is something actually we've talked about in the Council of Europe, is what happens when a state orders a measure and it has an effect on access to information in another country where that measure, where the content itself is lawful. I think here, quite possibly what you'd see is that the people who are affected in the other country should be able to complain about the measure in the country where the measure was ordered. And arguably, it raises sovereignty issues as well. Now, the other thing that we see very often is that it's not so much a problem. The courts order very often injunctions, but what's really difficult is for them to be enforced. So, for instance, if a court in France says that all the images of Mr. Mosley should be filtered, the question becomes, again, you have like, first of all, this problem, but it's not clear that this is something that once it reaches, say, Google in California, that you wouldn't have an issue of enforcement because there's no equivalence to enforce the judgment. So obviously, these are all issues that we're still grappling with, and I don't think there's any sort of simple answer, unfortunately, to these questions. Any more questions or experiences you'd like to share? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Mine is a question. I'm Jonathan Sembajwe from Red Sodianga Foundation, Uganda. We have a media program on one of the radio stations in Uganda. My question to you is, how can we empower children and young people to use the internet, especially the social media, to share productive information among their peers, maybe, and the entire public? Because some of them have got some good information to share with the rest of people and their peers, but especially in Africa, many don't know that the media, I mean the internet and the social media can be used in that productive way. Thank you.
I think that here the first thing that would come to mind is having education and trying to get maybe state subsidies to be able to have those training courses for these categories of people. I tend to think that for children it's probably easier because now they're born and raised, and usually in a lot of countries they already have those devices. I mean, they may be slightly different depending on the countries. Maybe in Africa it's via mobile phones. But certainly, I think, for example, I mean, I'm sure we all have elderly parents, for instance, who are struggling with trying to send an email. And I think that here it's what we're talking about is really trying to educate them to use those tools and training. And hopefully having state support to sponsor some of those by way of subsidies, for instance. Okay, so if there aren't any more comments, no, you'd like? Okay.
Yeah, I can as a youth comment on the youth thing. Yeah, there are so many possibilities with the internet, and many youth know about it, which is really, really great. But one of the things that can make a barrier for us using it as an innovation and using it a lot to make a change is if there are too many filters, too many controls, too much blocking the sites, because they're so afraid. So many adults are so afraid that the internet is such a dangerous place. And yes, it is, but it's also really, really great. So I think it's a lot better, instead of always talking about, when we're talking with our parents about all the dangerous things with the internet, we also have to talk about all the positive things. So they also see that the internet can also make a difference. So.
Thank you very much for all these positive thoughts on all the benefits that can be reaped from the internet. And I think it's actually really important to bear that in mind, because it's always easy to focus on the problems and all that's wrong, but actually if you looked at the proportion of problems versus all the benefits that we've been getting from the internet, I think we'd see that actually they're a much smaller proportion. All right, so I think that maybe if there aren't any more comments, of course, be very happy to continue. But otherwise, I would suggest that we take first questions from remote participants, if there are any. Yes? Okay, we'd be very, very happy to address them.
We have two questions from two people.
Okay.
The first one is from Davis Onsekia. The right to be forgotten is great, but it is applicable to the whole world from a Google perspective. Google was supposed to enforce it only in Europe, stand to be corrected. The first question.
No, I think here there's a bit of unclarity still as to how it should be applied. So far, what we've heard is that Google was applying it to Google.fr if it's France, or Google.sp for Spain, or ES rather, but only for the EU countries, but not beyond, not to Google.com. But it's been contested by the data protection commissioners because they've said that it would defeat the purpose of the measure, because all you need to do is, instead of doing your search on google.co.uk, for instance, you only have to go to google.com. But it's still something which is being discussed. Second question?
And the second question, what about second question from Alexander Saruk? What about state legislation to make most of ICP provides for users school service of filtering traffic to do not let bad ADS and content to see my children?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, generally speaking, as far as international law is concerned, there are standards that on access to the internet that seek to promote measures to empower people to get better access to the internet. What you also see, which is a completely different aspect, is that the use of the internet is more strictly regulated in certain places, so for example the workplace, but also schools, which raises a host of other issues. And I'm not sure which one it is, which of those two issues this question is addressed to.
It's school service.
Well, normally when you're looking at, for example, the use of the internet being more constrained maybe in schools, very often what you need to have a look at is whether or not the measure is, first of all, provided by law, and if it's necessary and proportionate, if it's reasonable. I think usually the filters in schools are generally regarded as being acceptable because it's for a particular place and they have a duty towards children. But now if it's beyond schools, it raises far more issues because you have to think about the broader public. Okay? Well, thank you very much, everyone, for staying for this session. We've heard some great thoughts about how to be, we got some very positive energy about all the benefits of the internet. I hope you've heard interesting comments that will help you think more about these issues and try and find some solutions. And once again, thank you very much for staying with us.